The call came at 2:17 a.m., the kind that didn't ring so much as vibrate into Mara Ellison's bones. Her phone lit up on the nightstand, without a name, without a number, without any reason it should have been trusted. She answered on the second vibration, already sitting up, already awake in the way that mattered. "This line isn't secure," the voice said. It wasn't distorted, it wasn't rushed. It carried the kind of calm that only came from practiced fear, the kind learned over time. "They've already ruled it a suicide." Mara didn't speak. Silence made people reveal more than questions ever could. The caller exhaled once. "I shouldn't have called you, but you're the only one who won't let this disappear." The line went dead. Mara remained still, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the empty connection. No callback, no trace. Whoever had reached out knew exactly how not to be found. She set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Suicide was a conclusion, not a fact, and conclusions delivered before dawn were almost always meant to outrun scrutiny. Rain slid down the window in uneven trails. The city looked cleaner when it rained, like it could wash itself free if it tried hard enough. Mara had learned better. Cities didn't cleanse themselves, they concealed. She dressed without turning on the lights. Yesterday's clothes, heavy coat, boots by the door, coffee untouched. Some nights didn't deserve routine. Outside, the rain met her like a held breath finally released. Streetlights blurred into pale halos. The city felt smaller at this hour, folded inward, private in a way daylight never allowed. She drove without the radio. Her mind worked backward the way it always did. Who benefited from speed? Who needed a death to be neat? Who needed the questions buried before sunrise? The address appeared on her phone without explanation. No message, just a dropped pin. A quiet dare. The townhouse sat on a narrow street that looked identical to every other one in the neighborhood. Trim hedges, clean sidewalks, porch lights glowing like nothing bad had ever happened there. Emergency vehicles crowded the curb anyway, their lights washing the rain in red and blue. Mara parked 2 houses down and sat for a moment, hands resting on the wheel. She watched the officers move, calm, methodical, already past urgency. That told her everything. Detective Jonah Reed stood near the tape, coat collar turned up, face half shadowed beneath a streetlight. He didn't wave when he saw her. He never did on scenes like this. "You get the call?" he asked. "Yes." Jonah nodded once. "Then you already know the story they're telling." "Tell me anyway," Mara said. Male, early 40s, found hanging in his home office, door locked from the inside, no signs of struggle, medical examiner leaning suicide. "And the part they're not saying out loud?" Mara asked. Jonah glanced toward the doorway, where a man in a suit spoke quietly with a uniform. Not police, legal. Lucas Marin was a municipal data auditor, infrastructure oversight, budget compliance. He flagged something last week, tried to escalate it. "And then?" Mara asked. "And now he's dead. Officially." Inside, the house smelled like paper and stale coffee, the quiet echo of a life interrupted. The body was gone, but the room remembered it. A chair centered beneath a beam. Rope cut cleanly. Desk lamp tipped but unbroken. No chaos, no desperation. Too tidy. Mara walked the room slowly, reading the space the way she read people. The absence of clutter, the way nothing looked disturbed enough. People in despair didn't curate their endings. She stopped at the desk. The laptop sat closed, still plugged in, still warm. Jonah watched her expression change. "Something wrong?" "Yes," Mara said quietly. "Everything." She opened the laptop. The screen came to life without hesitation. No password prompt, no delay. That alone was a message. Lucas Marin hadn't been planning to disappear. He'd been working. Spreadsheets filled the display. Dense, ugly, boring by design. Columns of numbers, routing codes, timestamps, meant to exhaust anyone who tried to follow them. Mara scrolled. Patterns emerged slowly. City funds routed through subcontractors. Emergency authorizations signed after the fact. Oversight reports amended quietly. Always legal, always clean. Jonah leaned closer. "You see it." "I see intent hiding behind procedure," Mara said, and someone decided he'd seen too much. A knock echoed from the hallway. "Detectives," a uniform said. "Internal affairs is on their way." Mara didn't look up. Of course they are. They copied everything carefully, not rushed, not sloppy. Redundant backups. By the time IA arrived, the laptop was back where it had been. The room returned to stillness. Outside, the rain had thickened, blurring the street into streaks of light. Jonah walked beside her toward the car.
If this wasn't suicide, he said quietly, then someone needed it to look final. Mara opened the driver's door. Then someone's counting on us to stop asking why. She started the engine and pulled into the rain-soaked street, already knowing this wasn't about one death. It never was.
The city had already decided how Lucas Marin would be remembered. By the time Mara reached the precinct later that morning, the narrative was everywhere. Suicide. Tragic but uncomplicated. A diligent civil servant overwhelmed by pressure. The kind of story that made people nod sadly and move on before lunch. Mara watched it unfold on muted televisions mounted along the bullpen walls. Anchors spoke in calm voices, careful not to sound accusatory, careful not to suggest blame. Words like no foul play and early findings repeated with practiced neutrality. She hated how quickly certainty settled in. Jonah Reed stood beside her desk, scrolling through his phone, jaw set. "They're moving fast," he said. "Too fast." "They always do when they're afraid of questions," Mara replied. She logged into her terminal and was greeted by a polite but unmistakable notification. Access limited, pending administrative review. Mara stared at the screen for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. That didn't take long. Jonah leaned over her shoulder. "They cut you off already?" "Not completely," she said. "Just enough to slow me down." Jonah snorted quietly. "That's new." "No," Mara said. "It's familiar." She stood and grabbed her coat. "Walk with me." They moved through the precinct without drawing attention, past officers pretending not to watch, past desks suddenly very busy with paperwork. The building hummed with routine, but something underneath it felt tight, restrained, like a breath being held. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist. The city looked gray and indecisive. "Lucas Marin didn't kill himself," Jonah said once they were clear of the doors. "I know," Mara replied, "but knowing and proving aren't the same thing." Jonah hesitated. His sister called again. Mara stopped walking. What did she say? She said Lucas had been paranoid the last few days, thought someone was following him, thought his emails were being monitored. Mara nodded slowly. "And did anyone write that down officially?" Jonah shook his head. "Not yet." "Good," Mara said. "That means it hasn't been buried properly." They reached Mara's car. She unlocked it but didn't get in right away. "I want to see his sister." Jonah blinked. "Now?" "Before someone tells her what she's supposed to remember," Mara said. They drove across the city in near silence, the kind that came from thinking too hard to speak. Mara replayed the scene in her head. The rope, the chair, the laptop still warm. People who planned to die didn't leave work open. Lucas Marin had expected to come back. His sister lived in a small apartment above a closed-down bookstore. The windows were dark except for one soft lamp glowing behind thin curtains. She answered the door with red eyes and stiff posture, like she'd been bracing herself since the knock came. "You're the detective," she said quietly. "Yes," Mara replied. "And this is Detective Reed." The woman stepped aside. "They already told me everything." Mara didn't correct her. She never did at the door. Inside, the apartment smelled like old paper and cold tea. Family photos lined the shelves. Lucas appeared in several of them, smiling awkwardly, always half turned away from the camera. "He wasn't like this," she said suddenly. "He wasn't fragile." "Tell me about the last time you spoke to him," Mara said. The woman swallowed. "Last night, around 9. He sounded scared." "Of what?" Jonah asked gently. She shook her head. "He wouldn't say. Just kept asking if I remembered our dad's advice. If something feels wrong, he used to say, write it down." Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Did Lucas write things down? The woman nodded. "Always. Journals, notes. He never trusted memory alone." "Where are they?" Mara asked. The woman hesitated. "I don't know. His place was cleaned. Not messy clean. Careful clean." Mara and Jonah exchanged a look. "Did anyone else have a key?" Jonah asked. The woman nodded slowly. "The city issued one, for inspections. He complained about it." Mara stood. "Thank you. You did the right thing calling us." After they left, Jonah exhaled sharply. "Someone got there before we did." "Yes," Mara said. "And they knew exactly what to take." Back in the car, Mara checked her phone. Another message from an unknown number waited for her. "You're misreading a tragedy." She deleted it without replying. Jonah glanced at her. "You getting fan mail?" "Warnings," Mara said. "Which means we're close to something they don't like." They returned to the precinct to find a quiet storm waiting. Internal Affairs stood near the captain's office. Doors closed, voices low. Mara didn't slow down. A man stepped into her path. Gray suit, city badge, legal affairs. "Detective Ellison," he said smoothly. "We need a word." Mara met his eyes. "I'm on my way to a case review." "This is the case review," he replied. The captain's office felt smaller than usual. The blinds were half drawn, cutting the daylight into stripes across the desk.
"You're suspended from field activity pending further notice," the captain said without preamble. Jonah stiffened. "On what grounds?" "Procedural overreach," legal affairs said. "Unauthorized data access." Mara didn't argue. She simply nodded. "Am I being accused of misconduct?" "No," the captain said. "Not yet." Mara smiled faintly. "That's honest, at least." Outside, Jonah swore under her breath. "They're boxing you in." "They're trying," Mara replied. "Which tells me Lucas wasn't wrong." Jonah leaned against the wall. "What do we do now?" Mara looked down the hallway, at the familiar chaos of the precinct, pretending nothing had changed. "Now," she said, "we work the parts they don't control." She pulled out her phone and typed a single message to a contact Jonah didn't recognize. "I need a favor, off the books." A reply came almost immediately. "When and where?" Mara slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Tell me everything you know about the city's emergency contractors," she said to Jonah. He frowned. "Why?" "Because Lucas wasn't auditing money. He was auditing silence. And silence, she had learned, was never free."
Being suspended didn't feel dramatic. There were no raised voices, no badges slammed onto desks, no public escort out of the building. It felt administrative, polite, quiet, and that, more than anything, unsettled Mara. She was still allowed inside the precinct, still allowed to use her desk, still allowed to sit in the same chair she'd occupied for years. What she wasn't allowed to do was move. Her access was trimmed, her authority softened, her presence reduced to something symbolic. Jonah noticed it immediately. "They didn't kick you out," he said as he watched an officer reroute a file away from Mara's terminal. "They put you on display." Mara nodded. "It's containment. Easier to control someone you can see." She logged out of the system and didn't log back in. Instead, she reached into her drawer and pulled out an old notebook, the one she'd stopped using when everything went digital. The pages were half filled with handwriting no one else could access or audit. "Lucas trusted paper," she said quietly. "So do I." Jonah leaned against the edge of her desk. "I pulled what I could before they shut me down too. Emergency contracting records, disaster response vendors, private compliance firms. Anything familiar?" Mara asked. Jonah hesitated. "Too familiar. The same names keep appearing. Different departments, different crises, same companies." Mara wrote the names down. She didn't circle them yet. Circles implied certainty. She wasn't there yet. The favor she'd asked for came through just after noon. A woman named Eliza Knox sat across from Mara in a diner 2 blocks from the precinct, stirring coffee she hadn't touched. She wore civilian neutrality like armor. No logos, no jewelry, no details that invited memory. "You look exactly the same," Eliza said. "You look harder to find," Mara replied. Eliza smiled faintly. "I worked at that." They hadn't seen each other in 5 years, not since Eliza had left municipal auditing under the polite label of career transition. In reality, she'd been pushed out after asking questions that didn't fit neatly into quarterly reports. "You said it was urgent and off the books." Mara slid a folded page across the table. Names, dates, routing codes. Eliza unfolded it slowly. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Recognition. "He was close," Eliza said. "Closer than he realized." "Close to what?" Jonah asked. Eliza glanced at him. "Close to proving that certain emergency frameworks aren't about response. They're about control." Mara leaned forward. "Explain." Eliza took a breath. "After every crisis, storms, blackouts, public unrest, the city activates special spending authorities. Oversight is delayed. Audits are deferred. Contractors move in fast. And then," Mara prompted. "And then," Eliza said, "some of those contractors never really leave." Jonah frowned. "You're saying disaster budgets become permanent revenue streams?" Eliza nodded. "Wrapped in enough paperwork that no one sees the whole picture. Lucas was mapping it, linking it to specific individuals." Mara's pen paused mid-word. "Individuals?" "Yes," Eliza said quietly. "Not just companies. People." The diner door chimed as someone entered. Mara didn't look, but she felt the shift in the room. Eliza noticed it too. "We shouldn't stay long," Eliza said. "They don't like witnesses comparing notes." "Did Lucas know he was in danger?" Eliza hesitated. "He knew enough to be afraid. He sent me an email 2 nights before he died." Mara's head snapped up. "What did it say?" Eliza pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly. She didn't hand it over. She angled the screen just enough for Mara to read. "If anything happens to me, don't let them call it stress." Mara closed her eyes briefly. "He attached files, encrypted. I haven't been able to open them." Mara opened her notebook again. "Who can?"
Eliza met her gaze. Someone who doesn't exist on city payrolls anymore. Jonah straightened. Private sector? Eliza shook her head. Worse, independent. Mara already knew the answer before Eliza said it. Jonah, Mara said, you still have that contact from oversight? Jonah's jaw tightened. The one who disappeared after the port inquiry? Yes, Mara said. I think it's time he reappears. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere had shifted again. Conversations lowered when Mara walked past. Doors closed more often. Someone had sent a signal, and the building was responding. Mara returned to her desk to find a manila envelope waiting for her. No name, no return address. Inside was a single printed page. Cease all unauthorized inquiries. This is your final notice. Jonah read it over her shoulder. That's not subtle. No, Mara said. It's impatient. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her notebook. Lucas Marin didn't kill himself, and he didn't die alone. He died in the middle of a system that assumes no one will notice the difference. Jonah watched her closely. And if we keep pushing? Mara stood, grabbing her coat. Then they'll make mistakes. Outside, the sky darkened early, clouds rolling in like a held breath about to break. Somewhere in the city, files were being moved, stories adjusted, silence reinforced. Mara Ellison stepped into the evening knowing one thing with certainty. They wouldn't have warned her if she wasn't already too close.
Mara stopped going home after sunset. It wasn't paranoia, not exactly. It was pattern recognition. The city felt different once the warning started, less chaotic, more deliberate. Cars lingered a second too long at intersections. Conversations ended when she entered a room. Silence followed her like a shadow that knew where she'd been. She used her apartment only to change clothes and pick up supplies. The rest of the time, she moved between neutral spaces, diners, libraries, parking structures, places where no one asked questions and everyone blended into background noise. Jonah adapted quickly. He stopped using his department phone and switched to a prepaid device that never stayed powered on for more than an hour at a time. He learned which cameras were city-owned and which ones hadn't been serviced in years. He memorized patrol rhythms the way some people memorize street names. You notice how none of this feels illegal? Jonah said one evening as they sat in his car, parked beneath an elevated rail line. Trains thundered overhead, drowning out their voices every few minutes. That's the part that scares me. It's not illegal, Mara replied. It's procedural. That's how it survives. They were watching a building across the street, unmarked, recently renovated, no signage beyond a polished plaque near the entrance. Civic Emergency Response Liaison Office. Lucas flagged this place 3 times, Jonah continued, never got a reply. Mara studied the entrance. No uniforms, no visible security, just people in clean coats moving in and out with briefcases and tablets. Who owns it? She asked. Jonah shook his head. That's the trick. No one, officially. It's a holding space. Contractors rotate through. Paperwork dissolves into other departments before anyone can pin responsibility. Mara wrote the name down anyway. Everything leaves fingerprints, she said. Even ghosts. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She didn't answer. A message followed. You are attracting attention you don't want. Mara deleted it. Jonah glanced at her. Another warning? Yes. He exhaled. They're getting closer. No, Mara said. They're getting nervous. They didn't stay long. Staying too long made patterns that noticed. The next morning, the retaliation became tangible. Mara arrived at the precinct to find her locker sealed with a red tag. Property removed, internal hold. Her badge still worked. Her name was still on the roster, but everything personal had been stripped away. It was symbolic. They're erasing you in stages, Jonah said quietly. Mara didn't react. She simply opened her notebook and added a new line. Escalation confirmed. By noon, the press started circling. Not aggressively, not yet. Soft inquiries, requests for comment about her ongoing review. The narrative was forming, careful and polite. Dedicated detective, burnout, boundary issues. Mara watched it from a distance, the way you watched weather roll in. You couldn't stop it. You could only prepare. Eliza Knox reached out again just after dusk. They met in the back of a closed community center where the lights flickered and the air smelled like dust and old paint. Eliza looked more tense than before. They accessed my accounts, Eliza said without greeting. Not illegally, requests, compliance letters, the kind you don't ignore. Did they take anything? Mara asked. No, Eliza replied. They copied everything. Jonah swore under his breath. They want to know how far this spread, Mara said. Who else knows? Eliza nodded. And they're going to make an example soon. You should be ready for that. Who? Jonah asked. Eliza hesitated. Someone close enough to hurt, but distant enough to deny. Mara felt the answer settle before Eliza spoke it. You, Eliza said softly. The silence that followed was heavy. I'm already suspended, Mara said. They don't need an example. Yes, Eliza replied, they do, because you're still moving. Mara closed her notebook, then we move faster. That night, Jonah finally cracked the encrypted files Lucas Marin had sent. They weren't dramatic, no confessions, no smoking gun. They were logs, audio timestamps, location markers, short clips of breathing, 7 seconds each. Proof of presence, proof of life. Proof that people the city claimed were unreachable had been reachable until someone decided otherwise. Jonah played one clip, then stopped. That's not evidence, he said quietly. That's leverage. Mara nodded, and leverage is dangerous. Her burner phone vibrated. Private number. She answered this time. You're making this worse, a man said calmly, professional, measured. You don't understand what you're disrupting. I understand perfectly, Mara replied. You built a system that survives scrutiny by exhausting it. A pause. You can still walk away, the voice said. We can make this end. Mara looked at Jonah, at the files open on the screen, at the names Lucas Marin had never gotten to explain. No, she said. You can't. The line went dead. Mara felt it then, the shift. Not fear. Commitment. They weren't warning her anymore. They were preparing to stop her.
The first casualty wasn't physical. It was credibility. Mara learned that before she learned anything else. She found out the way most people did now, through a notification that wasn't meant to feel accusatory, just informative. An internal bulletin circulated that morning, carefully worded and widely distributed. It praised her years of service, acknowledged her dedication, and then gently suggested that recent actions might indicate impaired judgment brought on by prolonged exposure to high-stress cases. Burnout. The word sat in the middle of the page, like a diagnosis no one had asked for. Jonah read it twice, then once more out loud, as if hearing it might make it less real. They're not saying you're wrong, he said. They're saying you're tired. Mara nodded slowly. That's smarter. Burnout didn't discredit facts. It discredited the person presenting them. It reframed persistence as obsession, scrutiny as fixation. It allowed the system to stay intact, while gently removing the irritant. By noon, the bulletin had evolved. A mandatory psychological evaluation was scheduled, not framed as disciplinary, framed as support. Wellness leave strongly recommended, temporary reassignment under consideration. Jonas slammed his hand lightly against the table in the safe house they were using that day, an old records office that hadn't been updated since the 90s. They're sidelining you. They're neutralizing me, Mara corrected, and they're doing it by pretending to help. Her phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't anonymous. Captain Hollis. She stared at the name for a moment before answering. Mara, Hollis said, his voice low, tired. I wish this conversation was different. I'm sure you do, Mara replied. They're concerned, Hollis continued. About you, about optics, about what this is turning into. Concern doesn't usually come with memos, Hollis said. Hollis sighed. You need to step back, just for now. Let this run its course. And when it runs its course? Mara asked. Silence. That's what I thought, she said. When the call ended, Jonah looked at her carefully. That sounded like someone choosing survival. It was, Mara said, and I don't blame him. They couldn't use the precinct anymore, not even the edges of it. Too many eyes, too many silent reports being written in real time. The city wasn't hunting them yet, but it was adjusting its posture, slowly closing lanes, reducing exits. Eliza Knox sent a single message. They're making their move. Watch who disappears next. The next disappearance wasn't a person. It was data. Lucas Marin's audit trail, what little of it had existed publicly, vanished from municipal archives overnight. Not deleted, reclassified, rerouted under a different project code that led nowhere. Jonas stared at the screen in disbelief. That shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't, Mara agreed, which means someone signed off. And that someone is protected. Mara opened her notebook and drew her first circle, not around a name, around a process. The system didn't remove threats directly. It absorbed them, dissolved them into bureaucracy until there was nothing left to point at. That afternoon, the first human cost arrived. Eliza didn't show up to their scheduled meet. She didn't answer messages, didn't ping back on secure channels, didn't log into the shared workspace they'd been using to track files. Jonah tried her burner. Disconnected. Mara felt the shift immediately, the way you did when a room went quiet too fast. They found Eliza the next day. Not dead. Worse. She'd been detained on administrative grounds. Compliance irregularities. Contractual violations dating back years. Everything legal. Everything devastating. She's facing charges, Jonah said, reading from the screen, his voice tight. Nothing violent, just enough to bury her. Mara closed her eyes. Eliza had warned them. Make an example. That night, Mara sat alone in her car, parked beneath a flickering street lamp. The rain returned, light at first, then steady, as if the city itself had decided to wash something away. Her burner phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered. This is the last chance, the voice said. Not threatening, calm, almost patient. You step back, we resolve this quietly. No more reputational damage, no more collateral. Mara stared through the windshield at the empty street ahead. You already crossed that line. We're preventing greater harm, the voice replied. You're not equipped to see the full picture. Mara smiled faintly. That's what every system says right before it breaks. A pause. You won't win this, the voice agreed. No, but I can make it expensive. The line went dead. Jonah knocked on the window a moment later, pulling the passenger door open. We've got a problem, he said. They're moving to seize your devices. Mara nodded. I expected that. And if they do? Jonah asked. Mara reached into her coat and pulled out a small flash drive, worn and unremarkable. Then they won't find what matters, she said. Jonah looked at it. What's on that? Everything Lucas didn't get to explain, Mara replied, and everything they're trying to erase. Jonah swallowed. If this goes public, it changes the game, I finished, and not in a way they can clean up. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the car. Mara knew this moment, the one where the investigation stopped being about truth and started being about cost. She met Jonah's gaze. If we do this, she said, there's no walking it back. Jonah didn't hesitate. Then we don't walk, he said. We burn a path. Mara nodded once. The system had taken its first real swing. Now it was her turn.
Once they decided to move, the city changed its posture. Mara noticed it first in reflections. A dark sedan idling half a block too long. A figure standing still where movement was expected. The subtle choreography of surveillance. Never close enough to accuse, never far enough to ignore. She didn't point it out right away. Neither did Jonah. Some things gained power when spoken aloud. They shifted locations twice that day, abandoning the old records office for a closed transit maintenance facility on the edge of the industrial district. The place smelled of oil and damp concrete, its cameras long dead, its access points poorly mapped. Jonah liked it for those reasons. Mara liked it because the city had forgotten it existed. Someone's tracking us, Jonah finally said, as he powered down his phone and slid it into a signal-blocking sleeve. Yes, Mara replied, and they want us to know. Jonah frowned. Why tip their hand? Because they're not trying to catch us, Mara said. They're trying to slow us down, make us doubt every move. They spread the files out across a folding table. Lucas Marin's data, Eliza's notes, financial maps that only made sense when you stopped pretending money moved logically. The pattern was undeniable now. This wasn't about covering up mistakes. It was about maintaining leverage. Emergency powers don't expire if the emergency never officially ends. You just rename it. Mara nodded. And you make sure the people who could question that never get the full picture. Jonah leaned back in his chair. You think Marin figured out how the pieces connect? Yes, Mara said. And I think he realized the audit wasn't the dangerous part. What was? Jonah asked. Proof of intent, Mara replied, which means he must have found something human, not procedural, personal. Her burner phone vibrated softly on the table. Unknown number. She didn't answer. A message appeared instead. We see you. Jonah stared at the screen. That's not subtle. No, Mara said. It's territorial. She typed a response with deliberate calm. Then you know I'm not stopping. The reply came faster than she expected. You're already too late. Mara felt the chill before she understood it. Jonah's phone buzzed a second later. His expression shifted as he read the message. They're moving, Eliza. Mara stood instantly. Where? Federal holding transfer. Oversight jurisdiction shift. If that happens, she disappears into process. Mara grabbed her coat. We can't stop it. No, Jonah said, but we can watch. They reached the transfer point as the convoy was already pulling out. Black SUVs, no markings, no sirens. Perfectly legal, perfectly invisible. Mara memorized license plates, driver posture, timing. She didn't chase. Chasing was what they wanted. Instead, she recorded. Back at the facility, they played the footage frame by frame. One driver stood out. Not because he looked suspicious, because he looked familiar. Jonah leaned closer. I've seen him before. Where? Mara asked. Port Authority case, Jonah said slowly. 5 years ago. Private compliance consultant. Mara felt the pieces locked together. They recycle people the way they recycle money. And they keep them just close enough to legitimacy that no one asks too many questions, Jonah added. The system didn't need killers. It needed facilitators. That night, Mara didn't sleep. She sat alone, replaying Lucas Marin's audio logs, listening to the breathing between timestamps, the spaces where someone had chosen not to speak, chosen instead to record proof of presence. Presence was power. Her phone rang at 3:06 a.m. This time, the number wasn't hidden. Private, she answered. You've misunderstood the arrangement, the man said calmly. You're not meant to expose this. You're meant to demonstrate why exposure is dangerous. Mara closed her eyes. By destroying anyone who tries? No, the man replied.
by showing them what happens when they persist. Mara leaned forward. Then let me be very clear. A pause. I'm documenting everything, she said. Every move, every transfer, every face. You won't be believed, the voice said. Mara smiled faintly. Not yet. The call ended. Jonah watched her from across the room. They're escalating. Yes, Mara said, which means they're afraid. Jonah hesitated. Of what? Mara met his gaze. Of what happens when this stops being about me. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket and set it on the table between them. We're past containment, she said. Next comes exposure. Jonah nodded slowly. Outside, somewhere in the city, the system adjusted again, closing ranks, tightening grip, preparing for something it had never been designed to handle. A detective who refused to disappear.
The name didn't arrive with drama. No red flags, no flashing alerts. Just a line item buried deep inside a funding document Lucas Marin had copied and renamed 3 times, as if even the file itself didn't want to be found. Jonah discovered it at dawn, hunched over the table, eyes bloodshot, fingers stained with ink and dust from paper records they'd scavenged out of old storage boxes. Mara, he said quietly. She looked up immediately. You found it. I found what signs the checks, Jonah said. He turned the laptop toward her. The Harrington Civic Trust. Mara stared at the name for a long moment. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was the opposite. The Trust's logo was on libraries, hospitals, scholarship programs. It sponsored public safety conferences and youth outreach initiatives. Its board members were praised for their philanthropy, their restraint, their distance from political noise. That's not a shell, Jonah said. That's a shield. Mara nodded slowly, which means everything underneath it is deliberate. They traced the structure outward. The Trust didn't issue orders, it issued recommendations. It didn't fund enforcement, it funded preparedness, emergency readiness, compliance partnerships, language soft enough to pass every ethics review without resistance. It's not a conspiracy, Jonah said. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't disappear when exposed, Mara recried. It adapts. Her phone rang. Not hidden, not blocked. Private number. She answered without hesitation. Detective Ellison, a man said smoothly. Or should I say, former detective. Mara didn't respond. I represent interests that value stability, the man continued. You've been reviewing materials that could be misinterpreted. Mara leaned back in her chair. That's an interesting word for documented patterns. A soft chuckle. Patterns require context. Then provide it, Mara said. A pause, calculated. You're pursuing this under the assumption that harm is being caused. What if the harm is being prevented? Mara closed her eyes briefly. People don't record their own breathing when they're being protected. A soft chuckle. Patterns require context. Then provide it, Mara said. A pause, calculated. You're pursuing this under the assumption that harm is being caused. What if the harm is being prevented? Mara closed her eyes briefly. People don't record their own breathing when they're being protected. The man sighed, not in frustration, but in disappointment. You're intelligent, which is why this conversation is happening. Jonah mouthed. Who is it? Mara cockered the phone briefly. Someone who thinks calling me is still an option. She uncovered the speaker. This can end cleanly, the man said. Your review concludes. Your reputation recovers. Your colleague relocates into consultancy work where his talents are better suited. And the people who disappeared, Mara asked. They were never officially there, the voice replied. Mara felt the temperature in the room change. Jonah typed rapidly, sending a secure ping to the oversight contact Eliza had mentioned before she was taken. Mara spoke again. You didn't call to threaten me. No, the man said. I called to offer you an exit. That's not an exit, Mara replied. That's erasure. Silence stretched. You don't understand the scale, the voice said finally. This structure exists because people want certainty. You disrupt that and you create chaos. Mara leaned forward. Chaos is what happens when lies collapse. Jonah's screen lit up. Oversight received initial package, requesting supplemental material. Jonah's eyes widened. The man on the phone spoke again, slower now. If you proceed, you won't be able to control what follows. Mara didn't hesitate. I'm not trying to control it. The call ended. Jonah exhaled sharply. That was negotiation. Yes, Mara said. And they don't negotiate when they're worried. Outside, the city woke up unaware. Commuters moved through routines. News tickers ran benign headlines. The Trust logo gleamed on a banner downtown announcing a charity gala scheduled for that evening. Jonah looked at it through the window. They're hiding in plain sight. They always do, Mara said. Power doesn't lurk in shadows anymore. It sponsors them. Her phone buzzed again. New message. Unknown. You've crossed a line that can't be undrawn. Mara typed back. Good. Jonah swallowed. What happens now? Mara looked at the files, the audio logs, the oversight confirmation blinking on the screen. Now, she said, this stops being local. Somewhere in the city, phones were ringing, emails were being drafted and deleted. Board members were calling lawyers who were calling other lawyers. The system had built itself to withstand scrutiny. What it hadn't prepared for was daylight arriving all at once. The shift happened quietly, the way real power always moved. There were no press conferences, no announcements, just a subtle change in who stopped returning calls. By mid-morning, Jonah noticed it first. "Their phones are going dark," he said, scrolling through his contacts. City liaisons, compliance officers, even 2 mid-level attorneys tied to the trust. They're not disconnected, they're rerouted. Mara nodded. Containment mode. When federal oversight entered a situation, the system didn't fight it directly. It stalled, delayed, buried requests under jurisdictional ambiguity until momentum bled out. Except this time, momentum wasn't coming from one direction. Eliza Knox reappeared digitally before she reappeared physically. A secure message hit Mara's screen at 11:43 a.m. Release delayed. Federal hold established. Not safe to communicate long. Mara felt her chest loosen for the first time in days. "She's alive," she said quietly. Jonah exhaled, and they couldn't make her disappear fast enough. The Harrington Civic Trust responded within hours, not with denials, with generosity. Emergency grants announced, scholarships expanded, a public donation to a disaster relief fund in another state. Their name flooded the news cycle, wrapped in benevolence and urgency. Mara watched the coverage without expression. "They're laundering attention," Jonah said, burying the narrative under goodwill, "and daring anyone to question it," Mara replied. Her burner phone rang again. This time the number was unmistakable. Office of Special Oversight. She answered. "Detective Ellison," a woman's voice said, precise and controlled. "This is Director Ames. We received your materials." Mara didn't respond immediately. "We're taking this seriously," Ames continued. "But I need to be clear. If your documentation contains errors, assumptions, or interpretive leaps, it will weaken the entire action." "I understand," Mara said. "That's why I didn't speculate." A pause. "You're aware," Ames said, "that if this proceeds, your career will not survive it." Mara glanced at Jonah. He didn't look away. "My career already didn't survive it," Mara replied. "That's not leverage anymore." Another pause, longer this time. "Then we proceed carefully," Ames said. "You are not to act independently. You are not to contact subjects. You are not to release anything publicly." Mara nodded. Understood. When the call ended, Jonah raised an eyebrow. "You going to follow that?" "Yes," Mara said, "until it stops being useful." That afternoon, the counterstrike arrived. Mara's credentials were formally revoked. Not suspended, not under review. Revoked. The language was clinical. Authority rescinded pending outcome of internal assessment. Access terminated effective immediately. Jonas stared at the notice. "They just made you a civilian." "They made me deniable," Mara corrected, "which means anything I say now can be dismissed as personal." "And anything you find," Jonah asked, "has to stand without me." The isolation was complete. No badge, no authority, no official channel, just evidence. That night, Jonah noticed the car parked across the street. Unmarked, engine off, windows dark. "They're not hiding anymore," he said. "No," Mara replied. "They're waiting. Waiting for her to panic, to make a mistake, to lash out and justify everything they'd already written about her." Instead, Mara packed a single bag. "What are you doing?" Jonah asked. "I'm removing myself from the equation," she said. Jonah frowned. "That sounds like retreat." "It's redistribution," Mara replied. "They expect pressure to collapse inward. I'm letting it spread outward." She handed Jonah the flash drive. "You give this to Director Ames," she said, in person. Jonah hesitated. "And you?" "I become what they can't control," Mara said, an observer. They didn't argue. They both knew the move made sense. Jonah left before dawn. By sunrise, the city believed Mara Ellison had vanished. Her apartment sat empty, her phone lines dead. Her name froze in mid-investigation like a story that ended without resolution. The trust exhaled. That was their mistake. Because disappearance was the one thing Mara understood better than anyone else. And she had left behind something the system could never erase. A trail of witnesses who had finally learned how to speak.
The story broke on a Tuesday, not because anyone planned it that way, but because systems always underestimated how quickly truth moved once it stopped asking permission. It didn't start with a headline. It started with a footnote. A public records journalist in another state noticed a discrepancy while reviewing emergency preparedness funding tied to the Harrington Civic Trust. A missing cross-reference. A circular authorization loop that led back to itself without explanation. On its own, it meant nothing, except the journalist had already received an anonymous packet the night before. Files with no name attached, audio logs with timestamps but no context, financial flows highlighted, not interpreted, just evidence. By noon, 3 independent outlets were asking the same question.
Why did a private trust have authority to reroute people through emergency jurisdictions without judicial oversight? The trust responded with a statement within the hour, calm, reassuring, emphasizing partnership, safety, and necessity. No denial, no explanation. That was when the second drop hit. This time, the audio went public. 7 seconds of breathing, a whispered name, a location marker that corresponded to a temporary holding transfer never formally acknowledged. People listened, and once they listened, they couldn't unhear it. The oversight office moved faster than anyone expected. Warrants followed, asset freezes, board members stepping aside pending review, consultants refusing interviews. The trust's logo disappeared from its website overnight. By evening, the word protocol was trending, not as jargon, as accusation. Jonah Reed watched it unfold from a borrowed office in the oversight building, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched in hours. Director Ames stood near the window, phone pressed to her ear, her expression unreadable. When she finally turned, her voice was steady. "It's done," she said. "At least the part that could be hidden." Jonah nodded. "And Mara?" Ames hesitated. "She stayed invisible." Jonah smiled faintly. "She said she would." Mara watched from somewhere else. A place without screens, without alerts, just a radio tuned low and the sound of the city moving on around her. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired. Because exposure didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. People would want answers, clean endings, someone to blame and someone to praise. Mara knew better. Systems didn't collapse. They fractured. They shed layers and reassembled under new names. But something had changed. Witnesses had spoken. Records existed. The idea that this had been necessary, quiet erasure in the name of stability, had cracked. That crack would never fully close. 3 weeks later, Mara Ellison's name surfaced again. Not in a reinstatement notice, in a report footnote. Independent documentation provided by former Detective M.E. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just presence. Jonah found her a month after that. A quiet cafe on the edge of the city. The kind of place people pass without noticing. "You vanished," he said, sitting across from her. "I stepped aside," Mara replied. "They offered you reinstatement," Jonah said. Mara shook her head. "I don't fit anymore." Jonah studied her. "What will you do?" Mara looked out the window at people moving through their ordinary lives. "What I've always done. Listen, document. Make sure stories don't disappear quietly." Jonah nodded. "The system's still there." "Yes," Mara said. "But it knows now. Knows it can be seen." That knowledge mattered. When they stood to leave, Jonah paused. "You won." Mara met his eyes. "No." I interrupted. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Busy, unaware, fragile in ways it never admitted. Mara walked into the crowd without looking back. The case was closed. The work was not. The aftermath didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with quiet phone calls, sealed envelopes, and people suddenly remembering conversations they'd once denied ever having. Jonah Reed learned quickly that collapse was never cinematic. It was administrative. Departments issued internal guidance revisions. Compliance protocols were temporarily suspended pending review. Consultants, once attached to the Harrington Civic Trust, quietly rebranded, their online profiles scrubbed clean within hours. No one said the word dismantled. They said restructured. Jonah sat in a windowless oversight office as another witness gave testimony, a mid-level coordinator. Nervous, cooperative, the kind of person who had never felt powerful enough to refuse orders, but had always known when to stop asking questions. "They told us it was temporary," the witness said, "that people would be released once things stabilized." "Did they ever?" Jonah asked. The witness shook his head. "Not that I saw." That answer repeated itself in different voices, different accents, different levels of authority. "Not that I saw. Not on my watch. Not officially." Every denial was clean, every gap perfectly legal. The oversight teams were drowning in material now, thousands of pages, audio logs, financial trails that looped through nonprofit shells, and emergency provisions written decades earlier and never retired. The work was slow, painfully slow. Director Ames warned everyone involved. This won't end with arrests the way people expect. This ends with restrictions, oversight, exposure, and careers. Jonah watched senior officials resign on moral grounds they'd never acknowledged before. Boards dissolved, trust funds frozen pending review, public apologies that said everything and nothing at the same time. Mara Ellison didn't appear in any of it. That was deliberate. She stayed where she was, moving quietly, listening more than speaking, not hiding but not visible, the kind of presence that didn't trigger alarms. She met with people who had never trusted institutions enough to speak before, people whose relatives had been relocated, people who had been told not to worry, not to ask, not to escalate. She documented everything, not to publish, to preserve. One evening, she sat across from a woman who had spent 15 years believing her brother had abandoned the family. "He didn't leave," the woman said, her hands shaking. "He told us it was his choice." Mara didn't correct her. She simply recorded the story. Because truth didn't always need correction. Sometimes it needed space. The city adapted quickly. New oversight committees were announced. New ethics guidelines circulated. The word protocol disappeared from official language, replaced by softer phrases. Risk mitigation, emergency coordination, interagency alignment. Different words, same instincts. Jonah found Mara again weeks later. This time, it wasn't chance. It was intentional. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, as they walked along a river path away from crowds and cameras. "They're drafting something." "What kind of something?" "A framework," Jonah said. "Limits, reporting requirements, external audits." Mara stopped walking. "That's good." "It is," Jonah agreed. "But it's also incomplete." Mara smiled faintly. "It always is." Jonah hesitated. "They're also writing you out of it." Mara looked at him. "Of course they are. No mention of your involvement. No acknowledgement. No record." Mara resumed walking. "That's the cost of forcing visibility. Someone has to stay outside the frame." Jonah studied her. "Does that bother you?" Mara considered the question. "It used to." They reached the edge of the river, water dark and steady beneath the bridge lights. Jonah leaned against the railing. "They won't try this again the same way." "No," Mara agreed. "They'll try it smarter." Jonah nodded. "And you?" Mara looked at the city skyline reflected in the water. "I'll keep listening for the calls that come in before dawn." Jonah smiled sadly. "You think there will be more?" Mara didn't answer immediately. "Yes," she said finally. "There always are." Behind them, the city moved on, grateful for the illusion of closure. Ahead of them, the work remained unfinished, because systems didn't fear collapse. They feared witnesses who never stopped watching. The city never marked the ending. There was no plaque, no ceremony, no quiet acknowledgement that something dangerous had been exposed and forced back into the light. Life continued the way it always did, efficient, distracted, convinced that stability meant safety. Mara Ellison preferred it that way. She stood on the platform of a nearly empty train station just before dawn, the kind of place where people pass through without leaving impressions. The air smelled of metal and rain. Somewhere above, the city was waking, unaware of how close it had come to forgetting itself. Her phone vibrated once. A message. No name, no number. They're asking questions again. Mara typed back a single word. Where? A location followed. Another city, another jurisdiction, another situation already described as resolved. She closed the phone and slipped it into her coat. Somewhere behind her, a train arrived with a low mechanical sigh. Doors opened, people stepped on carrying bags, worries, unfinished conversations. Mara boarded last. She took a seat by the window and watched the city slide past, each block layered with stories no one would ever document, unless someone chose to listen. She thought of Lucas Marin, who had recorded his own breathing because he was afraid his existence would be denied. She thought of Eliza Knox, whose career had been fractured so others could pretend order had been preserved. She thought of Jonah Reed, still inside the system, pushing where he could, knowing exactly how fragile progress was. And she thought of the voices she had recorded since then, the ones that came in late at night, the ones that didn't ask for justice, only acknowledgement. The train slowed. Another stop. Another city. Mara stood and stepped onto the platform without hesitation. She didn't carry a badge anymore. She didn't need one. She carried patterns, processes, memory, the things systems depended on people forgetting. As the train pulled away behind her, Mara adjusted her coat and moved into the waking city. Somewhere, a phone would ring before dawn. Somewhere, a conclusion would arrive too quickly. And somewhere, someone would decide whether to accept silence or interrupt it. Mara Ellison had already chosen. The case was never about stopping a system. It was about making sure it could never pretend it was unseen again. And that was enough.